Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into something pretty fascinating, a full-on critical look at the fossil evidence for evolution. We're going to explore the arguments of Professor Halis Aydemİr, who basically puts the entire fossil record on trial.
So the whole foundation of Aydemir's critique, where does it start? Well, he says it starts with a standard that Darwin himself actually set. Darwin knew, right, that his theory needed countless transitional fossils to be true. So Aydemir's big question is, okay, it's been over 150 years. Where are they?
So what does happen when you put the fossil record under the microscope, at least according to our source? Well, we're about to find out. We're going to investigate the evidence Professor Aydemîr lays out, and he argues that what we've all been told is solid proof. Well, in his view, it's really a story of misinterpretation, a lot of hype, and even, believe it or not, some outright fraud. All right, first up, Darwin's countless fossils. We're going to dive right into this foundational claim from Aydemîr. And you know, this isn't about finding just one missing link. For him, it's about the statistics of the entire fossil record. Here's the logic, and it's pretty straightforward. Aydemir's argument is this. If evolution is the slow, gradual process happening over millions and millions of years, then shouldn't the vast majority of fossils we dig up be these in-between forms? You know, creatures caught in the middle of changing. He says that the fully formed, stable species should actually be the rare find in the fossil record. But he argues what we actually find is the complete opposite. Okay, so now we get to the juicy part. Aydemîr presents what he calls a catalog of controversies. Think of these as specific case files he uses to build his argument. He points to a bunch of famous fossils that he believes show a pattern of what he calls a desperate search for evidence that just keeps leading science down the wrong path. He lays out these 4 big examples: Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, Orse Man, and the more recent Ida. Now, from Aydemir's perspective, these aren't just honest mistakes. Oh no, he presents them as exhibits, exhibit A, B, C, and D, if you will, in his case against the reliability of the evidence. So let's look at each one through his eyes. First on the docket, Aydemir's Exhibit A, the infamous Piltdown Man. This is a big one. He points out that for a staggering 40 years, the scientific world was celebrating this thing as a crucial human ancestor. But what was it really? It was exposed as a total hoax. A human skull, intentionally combined with an orangutan's jaw. And get this, the teeth were even filed down to make them look more ancient. But for Aydemîr, the real kicker isn't just the fraud itself. It's what happened because of the fraud. He emphasizes that over 500 academic papers, PhD theses, you name it, were published on the Piltdown Man. So he asks, what does that say about the peer review process when a discovery seems to back up the dominant theory? And he argues, look, this wasn't just a one-off thing. He points to Nebraska Man. The public was shown these incredible illustrations of a whole primitive human family. And it was all based on a single tooth. A single tooth that later turned out to belong to an extinct pig. Then there's Orse Man. Huge media excitement, another major human ancestor discovery, until, as he tells it, the skull fragment was identified as belonging to a young donkey. Now, you might think, okay, but that was all in the past. Aydemîr says, not so fast. He argues this pattern of hype continued right into the 21st century. His prime example, the 2009 fossil nicknamed Ida. I mean, this thing was unveiled with a massive global media campaign, a book deal, a TV documentary. They literally called it the link. So while the media was shouting from the rooftops, missing link found, Aydemir's take is, well, it's pretty blunt. He basically says, it's a lemur. A child can see it's a lemur. He argues it was never a human ancestor. For him, the insane amount of hype is the real story here. It points to this deep need for proof. Because think about it, he says, if transitional fossils were everywhere, why would one single find cause such a gigantic celebration? So this brings us to a broader point in Aydemir's argument. He says this pattern of trying to fill in gaps isn't just about fossils. He sees it as a kind of conceptual strategy, a way to explain away any part of biology that we don't immediately understand. And he actually coins a term for this. He flips the classic God of the gaps argument right on its head. He calls it the superstition of the gaps. His claim is that whenever there is a void in our scientific knowledge, the theory of evolution is just sort of plugged in as the default explanation. It's used as a placeholder for we don't know yet. But he says these explanations often don't hold up for long.
And he gives some pretty powerful examples to back this up. Take junk DNA. For years, it was dismissed as just evolutionary leftovers, useless baggage. Now we know it's incredibly important for regulating our genes. Or how about so-called vestigial organs, like the appendix? Once called useless, now known to have important functions. And then there's the coleoconch. This was a fossil fish, thought to be a 400-million-year-old transitional link to land animals, right up until they found one alive and swimming, basically unchanged. From his perspective, every single one of these was a gap in knowledge that was filled way too quickly by an evolutionary story that later turned out to be wrong.
So when Aydemir looks at the fossil record as a whole, this is the picture he says emerges. What do you see? You see a ton of sudden appearance. New, fully formed species just showing up out of nowhere with no clear ancestors. And you see a ton of stasis, species that stay exactly the same for millions of years. What's low? What's missing? That gradual transition that the theory absolutely requires.
Okay, so this naturally leads to the central question in Aydemir's whole critique. If the evidence is as shaky as he claims, why is the theory of evolution so dominant? His answer has less to do with science and more to do with philosophy.
He asks a pretty pointed question. Why would the scientific community repeatedly risk its own credibility on what he sees as hoaxes and massive exaggerations? For him, the answer is simple. This kind of desperation for evidence only makes sense if there's a severe lack of evidence. It suggests, in his view, that there's a commitment here that goes way beyond just the data.
And he uses a really provocative term for this phenomenon. He calls it evolution terror. Now, what he means by this is his claim that there's this intense ideological pressure inside the scientific world to conform to the evolutionary paradigm. He says that any scientist who dares to raise critical questions, well, they risk their career.
And this all builds to his final argument, his ultimate conclusion. Here's the logic he presents. 1, the theory provides a story for life's origins that requires no creator. 2, this makes it an absolutely essential foundation for any secular ideology. And 3, therefore, he claims, it's defended not just for scientific reasons, but for deeply ideological ones. And this chart really paints a picture of his perspective on what's driving all of this. According to Aydemir, if you look at why evolution is promoted so heavily to the public, he'd say the actual fossil evidence plays only a tiny part. The vast majority of the driving force? He claims it's ideological need, followed by a whole lot of media hype. So in the end, Aydemir's entire critique leaves us with a really challenging question. And it's a question that goes way beyond just fossils or evolution. It forces us to ask, if all evidence needs to be interpreted, how do we ever separate the real science from the stories we simply want to believe? How can we be sure that the stories we tell about our past are being driven by the evidence and not the other way around?